Welcome to Forum 360. I am Mark Welfley, your host today. Thank you for joining us for our global outlook with a local view. You need only turn the TV on for just about 30 seconds to understand the severe humanitarian crisis facing our world today. In response, hundreds of agencies and thousands of volunteers, donors, and trained specialists across the country and around the globe, all unsung heroes, have mobilized to answer the call of this crisis, and it's been impressive. Today, we will talk about the refugee settlement situation in Northeast Ohio and what we can do as a community to support their efforts. My guest today is Kevin Walter. Kevin is the Advocacy and Community Outreach Coordinator for the International Institute of Akron. The International Institute of Akron, located in downtown Akron, has for more than 100 years offered refugees and immigrants a new life in Northeast Ohio with dignity, connection, and belonging, serving a valuable population at a time of their greatest need. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. So, what is the International Institute of Akron, and when was it founded?
We are primarily a refugee resettlement agency. However, we started around, I want to say around 1916, primarily as a teaching institution to teach English to immigrant women, who at that time didn't have access to a lot of the resources and opportunities that the men had. So we started out, again, teaching English to the women, and that lasted for a long time, really until the modern refugee resettlement system was in place in the United States in 1980, at which point that really became our focus.
Okay. And today, with refugee resettlement, take me through a little bit of what happens when a refugee walks through your door, or refugees. How do you greet them? How do you understand what their needs are and go on from there?
We have actually, it starts before they walk through the door. We are their first contact upon arrival. Our case managers pick them up at the airport, at which point we've already secured housing for them. So we take them to their new home. We have a hot, culturally appropriate meal ready for them upon arrival as a little comfort food when they arrive. And it starts the next day. They come to our office, meet with their case managers again, and that's when we start. Right then, job counseling, start trying to find work, get them enrolled in English classes, meeting with our social services department to determine those needs, and starting the process of getting any kind of benefits that they're eligible for.
Where do the refugees come from, in the sense of who do you contact, who contacts you at the government level to indicate you're receiving X number of refugees, here are their names, here's where they're from? I mean, how is that connection made? So
we have a national partner, which is USCRI, the United States Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. And they are one of 9 national resettlement agencies that work through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So they provide us with all the bio data, the names, any medical history, ages, family units, anything that we need to know to get started. So we don't have any say. We don't pick people. We don't put in requests, for any certain populations. They assign that to us.
And approximately how many refugees, and I should stop and say, what's the difference between a refugee and an immigrant?
An immigrant really is anybody that came here from outside the United States for any reason. Refugee is a little bit different, especially, there's the public perception or the media perception of refugee, which is really anybody that has fled. And that's a good starting point. But for our purposes, a refugee is an official distinction, that's granted to an individual through the UN, and then they go through the channels of the State Department and Homeland Security to then be placed here. And really what that does is that provides them certain benefits and resources that they're guaranteed once they get here. They have permanent residency. They're on the path to citizenship at that point. Whereas people that come here on their own, they can attain visas on their own through other channels, but that doesn't necessarily make them eligible for a lot of the benefits that we provide to our clients.
Okay. So when we see on TV refugees sitting across the table from an intake individual, perhaps in the camps overseas, they're collecting this key information. Ultimately, that data is entered into a database, and then one of the 9 agencies I think you talked about then kind of figures out where best to place these refugees when they arrive to their destination. Is it the same here as it is in other countries? Is the model the same, or would Poland have, say, a different way of distributing refugees to where they need to go?
The model is pretty much the same as far as I know. I don't know the ins and outs of European resettlement processes, but you're correct. That interview, a lot of times they're establishing a credible fear if there is persecution based on there's a lot of things that could be based on. It could be sexual orientation, it could be politics, could be any number of things. So that interview kind of establishes. That's the first step to establish if they're eligible to become a refugee distinction, and then once it passes through the UN and they get vetted by the State Department, they go through that whole process. Then it goes to one of those 9 resettlement agencies for assignment.
So do you use volunteers and perhaps even donors who offer up their homes or their residence for the refugees, or do they stay in hotels or hostels, or how is that?
We do use
accommodations found.
Yeah, we use volunteers, not for that purpose. We have some limitations based on the model of our national partner, as for privacy regulations, things like that. That we can't just have them stay with somebody who wants to offer up a spare bedroom or something like that. They need dedicated housing. Anybody that might even have a spare apartment, we have to go through background checks, make sure it's appropriate housing. On the occasion that we haven't found permanent housing when they arrive, we have been, we can use hotels, we can use Airbnb, things like that for a short term, while we secure permanent housing.
Yeah. I checked out your website, iia.org, and noticed that you have numerous different services that you offer to refugees. Can you kind of tick through some of those and
Sure.
And what they are?
Yeah. Quickly though, it's iiakron.org.
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
Nope, no problem.
iiakron.org.
So we have 5 core services really. R&P, which is reception and placement, is the primary resettlement process. Those are the case managers, the housing team, anything that goes into the actual resettlement. And then we have an immigration legal department, which handles any of the adjustment of status they need, any asylum claims, helping them with their visa applications, their green card applications. That department also can work with really any immigrant in the community. Does not have to be a refugee. That service is open to anybody who might need immigration legal access. We have an education department that works primarily English classes, but also job skills, citizenship classes for people that are preparing to apply for citizenship. Our employment team, which does job counseling, job placement, and then also interpreting and translation, which works primarily outside of our agency in the community, providing language access for any legal proceedings, doctor's appointments, anything like that. We provide a lot of interpreting.
How large is the staff at the International Institute of Akron, and how are you funded?
We are up to, I want to say, about 28 people, so we're still fairly small. It was really cut down a lot during the previous presidential administration, so we're working to kind of rebuild capacity after that. So we're at around 28, and we're still hiring. We're still building. And as far as funding, we have a variety of sources. We get federal funding for every refugee that we resettle. There's a certain amount that goes to the individual and that goes to the agency for administrative support. We also get very generous support from local foundations and a lot of donations from individuals, anywhere from $5 to $10,000. You know, there is no limitation. We've gotten amazing donations from all walks of life in the community.
And approximately how many individuals might move through the program in a year's time?
It used to be that was probably a fairly straightforward answer. You know, and I would go back maybe 10 years. We were probably resettling in the 500 per year range, with probably our biggest year recently being 2016, which is the last year of the Obama administration. We settled about 800. And then after the election of that year, you know, every year the number was cut down. We did about 168 in 2019, and then COVID changed everything, you know, just with travel restrictions and who was even allowed in and out of the country. And we were just around 50 for 2020, but that was obviously an unusual circumstance. So really there isn't a typical right now, and it's hard to really know what going forward. The Biden administration has pledged to get numbers back up to where they were during the Obama administration. But again, COVID is still a factor. You know, there's still a lot of things at play to really know when that will take effect.
Sure. What area in your organization do you have the greatest need? Looking for a certain type of people with certain type of skills. Where's the greatest need at this moment?
I would say that right now, housing is probably the biggest need and the biggest challenge. That's the biggest, you know, individual challenge, just because, you know, affordable housing is a nationwide crisis for everybody, not just refugees. But, you know, with home prices and rents inflating, not at the same pace as pay, you know, it's difficult to find affordable housing for people that might be on public benefits. So that's a big challenge, probably the number one challenge that we face. But overall, it's just access. You know, it's language access. It's access to legal counsel, you know, for individuals who don't have that background or, you know, have not needed that before.
If you're just joining us, welcome. We are speaking with Kevin Walter. Kevin is the Advocacy and Community Outreach Coordinator for the International Institute of Akron. And we're talking about refugee resettlement in Akron and Northeast Ohio. How long, Kevin, are the refugees typically in the program, however you define that?
So the typical program maxes out at 90 days. And that's for our core services of the reception and placement and the resettlement type stuff. However, we recognize, and our partners recognize, that that's not long enough, you know, for people to really get settled in and establish themselves. So we have several other programs, what we call preferred communities, which is essentially our extended social services. For people that need extra time, need extra assistance. That extends out 5 years. Some of our employment programs extend out 5 years. As I mentioned before, our immigration legal services have no expiration. But the core services, it's a 90-day process.
Okay. And it's a hard question to answer, but what are the expectations of the refugee after 90 days, generally speaking?
At that point, you know, and again, we don't necessarily feel that's long enough, but you know, the ideal is that they will be secure in their home. They will have employment, you know, to make sure they have food security as well. You don't learn English in 90 days, but you know, hopefully they're on their way. They're attending classes, and really just starting to learn, you know, the way we live here, you know, and you know, our goal is not to get them to live like us. You know, we want them to retain, you know, everything that is them, you know, before they arrived. But just, you know, to know, you know, some of the cultural tendencies here as well.
Yeah. Can you share with me a success story? Pick out a person, you don't have to name names, and just kind of walk me through that person's the story.
Well, maybe not a particular person, but, you know, if you drive through North Hill in Akron, you're going to see a full stretch of grocery stores and restaurants owned by former refugees. You're going to see kids playing in the yard of homes that they have bought after moving through, as we talked about the, low income type housing, were able to save up, purchase their own home. They've started businesses. I assume he wouldn't mind me mentioning his name. There's an officer, Suba, with the Akron Police Department, as a former refugee, who has worked his way up in the police department. So people graduating college, who maybe spent their entire life in a refugee camp and had never been to a formal classroom. So just the overall success of the communities is pretty amazing.
I saw a story on, I believe it was your site, where a football player was a refugee who recently drafted and playing in the NFL. So that's an awesome success story. I know you haven't worked with Ukrainian refugees, but my question about that is, do you work closely with other agencies like your own in other cities to lend, if you needed support or translators? How does the communication between the agencies work?
The agencies all have very good relationships, personal and working. There's been movement, employees going from one site to another. Our national partner has an office in Cleveland. There are other international institutes, I believe, in Erie and Buffalo, and throughout the United States as well. So we do have a pretty wide network of support that we can reach out to for things like that.
Yeah. Do you foresee any Ukrainian refugees coming to the International Institute of Akron?
We would expect to see some. We have not traditionally been a resettlement site for Ukrainians, and they do tend to assign new cases where there is an existing community, and there are pretty well-established communities up around Cleveland and down in Columbus. So while we haven't been told specifically either way, we would expect that a large number would be going to one of those two sites in Ohio, but we are certainly prepared and open to resettling any Ukrainians that we can.
Sure. Right. So for people watching and listening today, how can the Northeast Ohio community reach out and help? What can they do?
There's a variety of ways. Monetary donations are always helpful, but we also understand that people like to have a little more connection. So we do offer. We have some volunteer opportunities in person, but again, we're fairly small. We don't have necessarily capacity to have the 300 people that might volunteer or ask to volunteer in response to a crisis. So we try to work with a lot of the groups that reach out to get creative in their own way, to build a fundraising effort any way they see fit, really. And we've had children, in schools do an after-school coffee shop, and they would raise $75 and send it to us. We had in Hudson a group of organizations led by the Hudson DEI Alliance that's been raising money for us to buy a new van, which has been a much needed resource for us. So that's ways to help. Advocacy is a big way. Right now with all the Afghans that arrived last year, their status is still in question, what that's going to look like. So there is the Afghan Adjustment Act. It's been stalled in Congress a little bit. They're trying to pass that. So calling your representatives, your senators, if you're an advocacy type person, that's very helpful as well.
If I could ask you to put on your looking glasses and stare into the future, what will the refugee resettlement model look like in 10 years, do you think? Will it look the same as today, or do you think it will change based on factors you see forthcoming?
Well, again, 5 years ago, I would have said it probably wouldn't change. It would probably look a lot like it does right now going forward, because that's how it had been for so long. But now seeing that it can be politicized, it can be used as a political tool, it kind of changes, certainty in the future. Our hope is that it would continue to support those that need our help the most, people that have been displaced, and the kind of resources we have in this country, that we will continue to open our arms to them.
I'm curious, is there like an ice cream stand, or is there a restaurant in Akron where when you take the refugees there, like their eyes light up, and so it's become like a place to go?
I can't really think of anything as like, an Akron institution or anything that has caught on that way. There's several, refugee-owned places that have become hotspots like that, especially in North Hill. There's, again, several restaurants and grocery stores that seem to be hubs of local activity.
Okay. So ice cream seems to be like a universal worldwide.
I would agree.
Worldwide flavor everywhere I've traveled in the world. Everybody loves ice cream, and I think you can't walk away after having had some ice cream with a frown on your face. So
I don't want to
off to a good start.
I don't want to favor one place over the other, but we go to Strickland's all the time. I live in Kent, so it's a bit of a drive for us, but it's worth it.
The cultural appropriate meal, I think you called it earlier. How do you seek those out, find what you need to prepare or have prepared, and have those prepared when the refugees first arrive?
It depends on the background of the individual arriving or the family arriving. There are several grocery stores and restaurants in the area. We know we can get halal meat, which is a staple in the, for the Muslim folks, and that really, it has to do with how the meat is raised, how the meat is slaughtered. Mm-hmm. So we have to make sure that that's appropriate. We have restaurants that can help out with that and have really come to our aid several times.
I want to talk about the children
Mm-hmm.
for a second, the children of the refugees or the immigrants, and as they integrate into the school systems in Akron, Northeast Ohio, are there resources for them to ease them into the system? I don't know, counselors, translators. How does that process work, getting the students kind of settled into their new schools?
There are certainly services. Our agency does not necessarily provide services for dedicated for children, other than what we provide for the family. Akron City Schools, Akron APS, has an amazing program, particularly at North High and the schools around North Hill, where a lot of traditionally the refugees have been located. Their language access is great. Again, like you mentioned, their counseling, they have people on site. So while we don't do that, the city of Akron and the Akron community really does a great job with the children. A lot of after-school programs, sports, daycares, things of that nature that really help them, get comfortable here.
Sure. Go back to volunteers for a second. You had ticked off a couple of different things that volunteers might offer. Could you offer your phone number if a volunteer would like to call you and see how he or she could be of assistance? Could
Sure.
you give us your phone number?
You can call our office at 376-5106. That's area code 330. You can also, there's a form on our website you can fill out expressing your interest in volunteer, or you can email directly at volunteer@iiakron.org.
Okay. Switching gears to the future of refugee resettlement, I noticed that when the pandemic had hit, that you had switched to largely an online service and are slowly moving back into the in-person. Do you foresee a time in the future where the refugees might actually be communicated with while they're in their settlement locations, like in their tents, where they already have met you online before they actually arrive to Akron?
I think
possible?
I think it's possible, and I think that would be great. I think that would really help ease the travels and some of the the anxieties involved with the travel. It would, as of the way it is right now, we don't get a whole lot of notice. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks. During the Afghanistan crisis, we had a couple cases that were less than 24 hours notice. So it would have to move, be established and be able to move fairly quickly to make that connection. But I think it would certainly be very helpful, not only for the people traveling, but for our staff as well.
Sure. How do you test, COVID test the refugees? How do you make sure that you as a staff stay healthy?
So we do have a vaccine requirement for our staff. We still have fairly strict protocols in our office with masking and sanitizing and social distancing. because we have to assume that a lot of people coming in are not vaccinated. There's been some vaccine hesitancy among some of the population, so we just have to assume that, we need to make sure that we're not infecting them. So we have that requirement. Newly arriving refugees, I believe now are required to be vaccinated. And they're tested as well when they get here. And part of, I mentioned before, those first couple days they're here, part is they go for health screenings as well. We get some bio data, I mentioned, ahead of time to see if there's any health issues, but then they do also get another check when they're here.
Thanks. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the number of worldwide refugees increased by 73% over the last 10 years. Economic instability and unforeseen global events are expected to drive this percentage higher in the coming years. In fact, the time for compassion and understanding is really just beginning. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. We can strive to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. I hope we can. Thanks for watching and listening. Let's keep our minds and our ears open until next time on Forum 360.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.